Hi, welcome to Woodruff and Strauss. Your hosts, Betsy Woodruff and Daniel Strauss, are on vacation this week, so you're stuck with us. I'm Jim Newell. I'm a politics writer for Salon.
I'm Patrick Brennan, and I'm opinion editor at National Review, and I think we're both happy to be pressed into service this holiday week. And
it's an honor. It's an honor.
So since it's almost 2015, we thought we'd kick off our show by talking about 2016 because it's almost becoming sort of acceptable, I think, in normal person terms, perhaps, to talk about it. So there was there's been some news on this front on both the Democratic and Republican sides over the past couple weeks, month or so. So we'll start on the Democratic side with there's still a lot of chatter about whether Elizabeth Warren is a potential candidate, is a viable candidate. And so Ruby Kramer has a story on BuzzFeed that went up last night, basically about how there's this sense that people would like her to run, but Ruby counted 49 times Elizabeth Warren has said, "I'm not running." But her fans point out that she speaks in present tense and doesn't say, "I won't run." So there's just a lot of, it seems like there's some desire for her to jump in. I don't know if it's just all on the part of the media class, but I'm wondering, Jim, that you're sort of a little closer to these, her fans than I am, maybe. What do you think is sort of driving that interest? Is it, so I can think of two possibilities. One, that people are dissatisfied with Hillary on an ideological level. They feel like she's not progressive enough, she's not she's too sympathetic to Wall Street, or is it the sense that maybe she wouldn't actually be as great of a candidate as people think? I know that polling suggests she's just this dominant Democratic front runner, and that she would pretty easily crush most of the Republican candidates, or all of them. But I'm wondering, what do you think is driving that interest on the left, or is it kind of like an entirely immediate concoction?
I think there's definitely some interest on the left, sort of among organized progressive groups who don't really just want to jump right into a Hillary Clinton coronation. And I mean, there are the same old problems with Clinton, that she's a corporate Democrat, too close to Wall Street. Her foreign policy is obviously a bit more hawkish than some of the Democratic Party would like. But you're right, it is a little bit, there's not this sudden swelling on the ground of demand for Warren across the country. I mean, you look at polls and it's still, Hillary Clinton still has like 70-something% approval among Democrats and about 60 to 70% support for the nomination, which may, that could tighten as things go on a little bit. But I think there's just a desire to give her a bit of a challenge, and she seems like the only one who might be able to put even a little bit of a scare into Hillary Clinton just based on the amount of money that she could raise. But I think my view on Warren is the thing about the present tense, where she says, "I'm not running," when asked. It sounds like a ludicrous theory, but it's pretty intentional, I think. I don't think she actually does want to run for president. But I think she knows that keeping the door crack just a little bit open gives her more attention, just because, us jokers in the media like to, only pay attention to people if they're talking about running for president. So I think I think she knows what she's doing, especially when she's asked. Like, she was on NPR a week or two ago, and she was asked, will you, rule it out in the future tense? And she wouldn't. So I think she knows what she's doing, and it's smart. It gets more attention to her and her issues, and I think there's a lot of provisions of Dodd-Frank are going to come up in the new Congress, and she sort of likes to have the attention focused on her and therefore focused on them. But
yeah, I think that's a good point. There's a lot of there's something like that going on the right too, with Jeb Bush and Romney, that well, again, both of them basically seem to be saying, Jeb has now shifted his stance, but Romney basically keeps saying, I'm not going to run. But people are always asking, they're like, is he going to run? Like, when I'm home, I'm home for Kirsten, Massachusetts right now, and lots of people are just like, it's Romney country, this is the moderate Republican heartland. And so people are like, is Romney going to run? And I give them a similar answer, which is that it's a different situation than Warren, but that basically he's not going to entirely rule it out because he wants to maintain his profile. And I think that there's like a cynical read of Warren or Romney trying to maintain their profile that just like it's nice to have people listen to you, and it's nice to be able to, if you're Warren to raise money, or if you're Romney to be asked to go on Morning Joe or whatever. But also they genuinely think that they have a lot to give to bring to their party, and so they want to maintain influence, and the easiest way to do that is to suggest that you might be running for president. I'm wondering, do you think that Elizabeth Warren's gambit during the Cromnibus debate, where she sort of tried to defeat one of the sort of the first the proposal that Democratic and Republican leadership agreed to keep the government open, Warren kind of tried to blow that up when it was in the House, which is almost a Ted Cruz-esque move. It ended up being not successful, but it was not too far from being successful. Do you think that people were people on the left were impressed by that? Was that it was unsuccessful, but like, was it an encouraging sign from her?
I think people were, I think it was an encouraging sign. I think just the amount of attention she was able to bring to, a language about a derivatives provision in a bill, that somehow became the focus when, everyone thought going into it that all the focus was going to be, all the pressure against it was going to be from the right for the for funding Department of Homeland Security. So I think that impressed people, and it was a little overblown. If Elizabeth Warren had killed that bill, there was a short-term, continuing resolution ready to go, so the stakes weren't quite as high. There wouldn't have been a shutdown. But there was one interesting article a few days ago talking about banking lobbyists who are coming back, looking at. Sorry, someone just knocked at my door, but I'm going to ignore that for now.
It might be a banking lobbyist.
It might be a banking lobbyist, yeah, coming to hunt me down. They were going to look to weaken Dodd-Frank, a lot more in the new year, and a couple of them were saying they're going to have to recalibrate now that even this minor thing that they were trying to get done in the Cromnibus was so difficult to achieve. So, it may have been an actual tangible victory, and I think Elizabeth Warren knows that as long as the spotlight is on her and she can give more attention to these things that sort of may make people's eyes glaze over otherwise. But the thing about you were talking about Romney. So Romney had been saying for a while that I would only consider running basically if Jeb Bush doesn't consider running, because they sort of occupy actually Romney hasn't said anything. Those were his people, who I don't know how close they actually are to him. But But
I think they know what he's thinking, but I think that they're more they would like him to run more than he is actually likely to run. So they're presenting this.
Yeah, I didn't know, because when Jeb, made that move last week where he said, whatever it was, I'm considering the possibility of maybe eventually running for president at some point, or whatever it was. I don't know. There was pushback from Romney's people, Jeb's decision won't play into what we want to do at all. So I wonder if Romney had sort of turned a corner where he actually was starting to want it again, and if now he's because it seemed like even a few months ago that Romney was just everyone just shut up, I'm not running, and now I don't know, it seems like he's maybe been a little bit talked into it.
I don't know. I think it does remain it seems to be driven a lot in part by his staffers and people who trust him and like him a lot, who really would like him to run. There's certainly this demand among establishment donors and advisors and stuff for Romney or Jeb maybe to run. But they also surely are aware that there is a whole lot of there are a whole lot of rank and file Republicans and conservative activists and stuff who just think that is the most ludicrous idea in the world.
Right.
Which I don't think is a ridiculous reaction. Even though they both bring things to the table. I mean, one is a two-time failed candidate who never got along with the conservative base anyway, and the other guy is like pro Common Core, pro immigration reform, hasn't run for office since 2005.
Are people are conservative activists? I mean, like liberal activists are sort of vomiting at the idea of having to give Hillary Clinton, the nomination, just sort of a coronation. Is it the same way with Jeb Bush? Is it?
Yeah.
I mean, do you think it's worse than it was going into 2012 when it looked like Romney might sort of, be the guy who I guess the early front runner?
Yeah, I think it's worse. Because like it's a Bush, and so there's this real sense, and I think this is something historical, and I think this is shifting among people who don't think about politics like 24/7. That just like the idea of going back to a Bush, and there's this sense there's this belief among conservatives that like the Bush years is what delivered us the Obama years, and like that's probably true, but maybe more in the way that conservatives wouldn't like to believe, that it was like probably a lot about the Iraq War, and it wasn't like the big spending that Bush did, although the Iraq War was big spending, but big domestic spending that Bush didn't govern as a conservative, and that's why we ended up with Obama. There is that kind of idea out there, and I think that's not. I don't think that's a particularly accurate diagnosis of what happened, but that's a real sense. It's a real belief. And also in 2012, I think a lot of people each of the sort of these conservative challengers rose and then fell, basically out of their own doing. And so I don't think there were a lot of people who genuinely sort of conservative activists who really thought that like we really wanted Rick Santorum or Herman Cain to be our nominee. And even Rick Perry. But now there's this sense that we've got a lot of young blood out there who are now willing to run. And so like, why are we talking about Jeb and Mitt when you've got this supposedly very deep bench? I mean, I think it is, but we'll have to see how viable they are. Which I guess takes us to another angle on 2016, which is that Rand Paul and Marco Rubio have been trading some body blows over the past few days about Obama's Cuba policy. So Obama sort of announced last week that he wanted to reestablish diplomatic relations with Cuba. He can't end our diplomatic embargo because Congress codified that in the Clinton years, but he's going to significantly change the way the U.S. relates to Cuba. And this is kind of like the perfect issue to create sparks between Rubio and Rand Paul. It's not at the top of anyone's foreign policy, of the sort of political foreign policy heap in terms of importance. But like you've got sort of Rand Paul at one point said that he thought that Rubio had no idea what he was talking about when it came to something like that, when it came to Cuba policy, and like Rubio's like, well, I'm the son of Cuban immigrants, and then Rand Paul can take this sort of libertarian take, which is like he was saying, oh, this is an instance where Marco Rubio is the real isolationist, and so he's sort of deflecting this criticism he's gotten a lot. So this is not. It could matter in a very tangential, in a marginal way in like Florida, so it actually could be very important to this 16. But obviously, the Cuba thing is just emblematic of this larger feud between Rubio and Rand Paul, and then Ted Cruz is somewhere in the middle. And I'm wondering, do you feel like that? Does it look to you like from the left, kind of like this is like a lot of posturing, and that there's not sort of big differences among them, or is there? Do you feel like these guys actually might actually govern differently in terms of foreign policy, or is this just kind of like a thing where they're picking fights about this?
Well, I think the one thing that's interesting about this sort of this so-called split on the right between more muscular interventionism versus I guess the word that's used is isolationism, which is not exactly correct, but a more restrained foreign policy, I guess you could say. But it's basically everyone versus Rand Paul. Like it seems like the field is going to shape up to be pretty hawkish, as it usually is in a Republican primary, and we'll see how Rand Paul sort of manages that. He tries to thread the needle. He was all over the place with ISIS, He was agreeing that we need to destroy them, but he was also criticizing, interventionism in the Middle East in the past for making things worse than they were better. But I think with this Cuba issue, I don't think it's going to be a defining foreign policy battle. But who knows what could come up in primary debates. But I think it's good for Rubio in that one, I believe his protests are deeply felt. Like he's not just being opportunistic here. I mean, this is obviously something very personal to him. But it's also, Rubio's sort of a candidate that's been looking for something on which to, stand his ground. He had, he was looking like he was going to try and get immigration reform through, and then that fell through, and he's sort of been paying penance for that. And now he has Jeb Bush sort of coming on his territory, the slot that he might occupy in the race. So Rubio sort of needed a way to define him because he was sort of losing a rationale for his campaign to a certain extent. So I think this is good for Rand and Rubio, this little fight, which is I think why they were so willing to continue it after it had gotten pretty childish. But
yeah, I mean, in theory, this is it was a pretty the fact that they're like going back and forth on like Twitter is not exactly what we think of when we think of Senate colleagues, but I guess it's a new world. I mean, I think Rubio, right? It would be very hard for Rubio to distinguish himself by being hawkish, like because there's not an appetite for being like super hawkish. Like I don't think John Bolton run for president, but there's not really an appetite for for an ultra hawkish candidate. I think because generally the question is like, how much do people regret interventionism in the Middle East? Like, do they regret it enough to say it's not a big deal when they're like beheading journalists, or so he can't sort of get out there on the right on foreign policy. I think there's some appetite for calling for increased defense spending, maybe. But he had a hard time doing that, so the Cuba thing offered him an opportunity to do that. I mean, on domestic policy, if in like sort of really into the weeds, like I think he's gotten some respect from some kind of a reform conservative type people. So he's been coming up with a lot of same policy proposals as like Mike Lee, and so he's done some stuff on that. And coming up with a different way to look at individual income tax reform. And so those are all like still kind of things that people aren't paying attention to a lot. But I think he's won some credibility in like sort of conservative intellectual circles with that. But that is not that's not necessarily for now making some presidential campaign.
I mean that's not going to create like a huge ground swelling of activists in Iowa or something.
Yeah, no, but that's quite true.
But yeah, I don't know. I mean, am I getting this balance of sort of foreign policy? I know these are very black and white terms, but where, when people talk about, this strain of isolationism in the Republican Party or whatever, I mean, of the candidates who are looking to run, it seems like Rand Paul is the only one who wants, who's going to run a campaign maybe on, less saber rattling and, it seems like all this talk about a more restrained foreign policy is all about Rand Paul, which maybe is good for him because then that whoever in the party agrees with him can sort of coalesce around him.
Yeah, I think there's a few things going on. I mean, one, I think a lot of people, whether they think about this or not, are who are on the right really do want to think of the Republican Party as the party of national security. I mean, that is like if you go back in the conservative movement. I mean, that was sort of like one of the key. That was like the thing that the conservative movement sort of coalesced around was anti-communism, and it's a different battles today. But I think a lot of just your sort of rank and file Republican conservative voters don't necessarily think about that, but I think that they do feel that that like anything that sort of begins to sound a little like appeasement or anti-Americanism. I think is they like the military. They generally trust the sort of national security state. They trust the intelligence community. So, like while there are Republican politicians who were sort of big on NSA reform and stuff, it doesn't. There's not a lot of I don't think there's a ton of political points to be scored there in a Republican primary. Whether it might be work at attracting like millennials or moderate voters, I don't know. And certainly then within the donor base, there are the kind of business, sort of Chamber of Commerce type Republicans who don't really care, who don't sort of care much about these issues, and maybe during the worst of the Iraq War started to feel like it was a real drag on other priorities, and it certainly comes with real economic costs. But there's also a lot of hawkish donors who care a great deal about this kind of thing, and it even feeds into kind of like, you see this on both economic conservatives and national security conservatives, where like there's even a certain kind of like paranoid style to these things, and so you can like score points by saying we did absolutely make sure that Iran doesn't get a nuclear bomb, which is it's a perfectly important priority, but it doesn't seem like the kind of thing that really like is going to resonate as like a key issue. But there is a lot of appetite for that. I mean, there's so much that like, I don't know exactly what he's thinking, but Lindsey Graham has mooted the possibility that he would run for president. I don't know. Why?
I think that's totally a I want attention thing, but I don't know.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I have to imagine it is, but the very fact that he feels like that someone's going to listen to that, and when there's already like a crowded Republican field, he's not particularly popular senator from South Carolina, but is considered an authority on national security issues. He's very trusted on this. He's been a big leader on this stuff, and he writes legislation that's useful to national security conservatives. He wants to get, for instance, it couldn't get probably to where it needs to be in terms of votes in the Senate, but he wants to get Congress to approve any deal that this final deal is reached with Iran. But so the very fact that he is has talked about it, and like even these more marginal candidates, like the fact that John Bolton, the Bush's ambassador to the UN, and sort of a widely trusted guy on the right about sort of international issues, arms control, that kind of thing. The fact that he has talked about it, and he started a PAC and spent millions of dollars on candidates in 2014, shows, I think, that period of regret over being too hawkish in the Bush years, I think, has rapidly receded.
Right. What about anything else on this area, or I don't know. We can always come back to it, I guess. But yeah. I think we also want to talk today about one of the bigger battles in the beginning of the next Congress, which is going to be over funding for the Department of Homeland Security. Because in this latest spending bill, it funds the government through September for 11 of the 12 departments. But then there's a 3-month, I think it's 3-month extension for the Department of Homeland Security, because that's the department that would enforce Obama's executive action on immigration. So the idea was to sort of keep it on a short leash. What I was wondering is, is this just a pure punt in that they're like, well, we'll figure out how to deal with it next year, or is there a plan for what to do about this when it comes up in a few months? I mean, there are people who are not going to. I mean, there are people who got trouble already for funding Obama's quote-unquote illegal amnesty for 3 months to begin with. Is this going to be a real fight next year? Is it possible that Homeland Security funding might lapse for a period of time?
So I think that the reason that there was this big, or that there was some backlash among conservative circles about it when the government funding bill passed a week or two ago, was because conservatives and those who are most interested in fighting Obama's executive immigration orders don't really believe that there is a plan, or worse, don't think that the Republican leadership actively doesn't want to fight it at all.
Right.
which it seems to me to be taking a little too far. But there are definitely groups that think that they're not that Republican leadership doesn't want to fight it because they actually agree with the policy. I mean, which actually strikes me as sort of inverted. So I've heard from some people that they're like, well, the thing is, of course, Boehner and McConnell, they have this genuine constitutional objection to the process, to the way it was done. But they agree with amnesty, and that actually, it strikes me that kind of reverses what might actually be going on, which I think is that, if you're Boehner or McConnell and you're trying to advance conservative policies and stuff, I don't know, it strikes me that they don't always have a ton of time for, preserving the constitutional order. I mean, I'm sure they do care very deeply about it, but I think it's easy to say, well, look, these sort of niceties. I mean, I think it's very important, but then on the other hand, they know that eventually, look, these people that are now will in the new year be effectively protected from deportation, however many of them there will be, are not going to be deported under the Obama administration. They were probably never going to be deported under any policy that we've had. It was highly unlikely that any of them were going to be deported, except in very small numbers. So, it's possible that this order could shield people who have low-level felony convictions or misdemeanor and things like that. That they have a drunk driving arrest or something, which is the kind of thing that probably you might think that they should be deported for. But and so maybe under a Republican administration they would be. But really, I mean, these people are here more or less, and they're more or less to stay. And under the right. It would be spaced out differently than the Gang of Eight immigration bill that passed a year and a half ago now. But that there is Republicans. Even Ted Cruz said, yeah, of course you need to have a plan to deal with those who are here legally. It's just about what do you get in exchange for it, and what kind of immigration policy do we settle on? How much border security? What levels do you set legal immigration at? Do you have guest worker programs and all these things? So there's not. I mean, I know that people like things, but that say oh, there's this I forget what the term is, but I guess leadership aides in D.C. have various terms for sort of the crowd, just basically who wants to deport 11 million people, and I don't doubt that there are people that there are Republicans who think that we could do that or who would like to do that, maybe, but it's not really it's not a political strategy that that almost anyone in Congress is thinking about. So that
I think it's interesting that you were saying, I guess there's some belief that the reason Boehner and McConnell aren't going after this more than they have been is because they like the policy. I mean, I think that's clearly a little paranoid. I think it's mostly. I think if they had a way to get rid of it pretty easily, then they would probably do it because it would be a good victory. But I think they just recognize that you're not gonna want to go all the way to the mat to get rid of this thing, especially with the presidential election coming up, which I don't know. It may not be the best fight to pick going into a presidential electorate, but
people have short memories, short political memories. So I wonder, but I have no doubt that they will think that they will be thinking like that. Yeah, for sure.
But I just wonder if maybe the idea is, or maybe the hope is, in a few months that some of the anger will die down a little bit, and if they just go ahead and fund DHS for, I don't know, would they probably do another? Do you think they would fund it through the rest of the fiscal year, or maybe another few months at a time or something?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I suppose that what they would want to do would be to pass a DHS. Well, so that the House and the Senate. Well, the House would pass it, and then the Senate would be debating over not see if you could get it past a filibuster or DHS spending bill for 9 months or whatever, 6 months through the end of this fiscal year. Say that has a rider on it that says that this can't, that you basically can't implement this. And if the president, so one of the debates over this was whether that DHS doesn't really need the funding to, first of all, most of it is sort of automatically funded anyway. So if DHS runs out of funding, it's when the federal government shut down, people were, hundreds of thousands of federal workers were furloughed and various operations shut down. But it's now been sort of set up that the Office of Management and Budget basically just tells people to keep doing their jobs. And I don't know the exact specifics of this, but you'd have to assume that almost all of the Department of Homeland Security is in the category of like just keep doing your jobs.
Right.
So I don't imagine the operations of DHS would be disrupted very much if they ran out of funding. But
you have to resolve it at some point.
Sure, right. And then I guess specifically the agency that would be dealing with this is USCIS, which is the Customs and Immigration Service, I guess. And they actually can apparently sort of operate in perpetuity without any funding because their entire budget is from fees. Exactly. So there were some Republicans who said, look, this actually, you can't defund Obama's amnesty because it's paid for with fees. But it's obviously true that you can pass a spending bill that says the president can't do this, and if the president signs it and then still tells USCIS to do whatever you just passed whatever he just signed saying he wouldn't do, that would be a problem. So the fight will be, I guess, trying to get him to shame him into signing a bill that gives up on the executive orders. But the leverage is not all that substantial, and it's like not the kind of thing that you want to hold hostage. The thing I remember one of my coworkers saying that like the thing here was that you needed to have something that Democrats really want to fund and really have to, like, for their political interests or whatever, that they need to keep open.
I read a post similar to this, yeah.
Yeah, well, one of our contributors was like, we should just sort of tie amnesty funding to the EPA, and then Republicans or the Democrats will have to. but because that's the thing is, like, it's a really tough thing to say. So we're concerned about border security, and therefore we're not going to fund the Department of Homeland Security until you relent and agree not to implement your executive order. So I mean, it's going to be a tough fight.
Yeah, Yeah, I'm not sure. I guess the president would probably, unless they found some other really tricky way to do it. But I mean, if there was just a bill with that rider, then he would veto it, and then I don't exactly know where it goes from there. But I don't know, maybe another protest vote or something. But I think conservatives seem pretty sick of the protest vote that they know is obviously not going to actually change policy in any way.
Yeah, I mean, I think so.
Are there conservatives who are happy to have a protest vote that they can sort of, show off to everyone? Or
if there's a protest vote with sort of relatively low stakes, I mean, I think there's still an appetite for that, just because it puts Republicans on record, and this is something that National Review sort of editorially said we believed, which was that Republicans need to be on record against this, that just as a matter of principle and a matter of politics, and I think for some people just to say, look, we don't think the president can do this. And it also removes the temptation of the ability of future Republican presidents to, like, lower the capital gains rate by not enforcing, tax collection to the IRS, I think was overstated. But there probably are instances maybe of where they could have, sort of take a very wide understanding of prosecutorial discretion. So it would be one way to say, look, we really don't agree with this, and to bind future Republicans, and and maybe make future Democrats think twice about it too. And then also, I think there's also like an endless appetite, at least among some politicians. I mean, a certain junior senator from Texas comes to mind who forced this. It's not clear whether he forced a protest vote in the Senate the weekend that the government funding bill passed. He raised a point of order saying that the bill was unconstitutional, which didn't seem like very good Senate strategy. There are opponents of his who argued that actually helped Harry Reid get through all of Obama's nominees before the end of the session, which he might have not have been able to do otherwise. So it was like a misreading of sort of Senate procedure, and then it's also arguably a misreading of what a point of order in the Senate, a constitutional point of order is, because the bill itself was not unconstitutional. I mean, you could argue that funding something that is unconstitutional is, but there's something in the bill itself that was
right.
So it was a weird moment, but Cruz has certainly done a number of these things. How many more does he need? I don't know, to look at it very cynically, but.
So, let's move ahead to another most insidery of all insidery things, but also somewhat interesting, we think at least, which is about the who's going to lead the Congressional Budget Office. The Congressional Budget Office is the nonpartisan office within Congress that scores the effect of legislation on the budget. And since 2009, the Democratic appointee who's been in charge of it is this guy, Doug Elmendorf. And there's been sort of a debate on there, because Republicans will get to pick the new, now that Elmendorf's tenure is ending, they're going to be able to pick the new leader. And there was some debate about whether they should reappoint Elmendorf or pick someone maybe with a more conservative pedigree. And last night, Bloomberg News reported that they're not going to reappoint Elmendorf. And this is sort of, this sounds very bureaucratic. It may not eventually add up to much of anything, but the stakes here are, if you're talking about corporate tax reform next year, or whatever form of tax reform, it's going to depend, the difficulty of it is going to depend on how they score it. And a lot of Republicans are talking about the need for instituting dynamic scoring, which sort of takes the macroeconomic effects of the legislation you're passing into account of the score. So the question is what assumptions you would put in the dynamic scoring. If you put in very strong supply-side economics that tax cuts pay for themselves, then you're going to more easily be able to do tax reform without cutting out a lot of the loopholes. So this is very boring. I'm realizing it as I'm describing it. Would you like to maybe put it another way, Patrick?
Well, yeah. When the case for why this is exciting and important is how it'll matter to the likelihood of corporate tax reform. I guess we realized we may have picked the wrong topic, but no, you're exactly right that will probably be the first piece of that would be the first big debate that would be affected by it. And it is one of the biggest debates, and one of the reasons for that is you can't pass. So when Congress passes like tax cuts, basically they have to they don't necessarily have to be paid for, but if they're permanent, they have to be paid for. So this is like really into the weeds, and I can't speak terribly confident, but one reason
if you do it under regular order, if you do it under reconciliation, there's only a 10-year horizon. So if you want it to be permanent, then it has to be paid for.
So this is one reason that so the Bush tax cuts were temporary, and for that I believe for that reason. And so one thing is that there is this belief that that's the key thing that Republicans have never been able to do. They've never been able to permanently cut taxes the way that they'd like to, or haven't been able to for a while because of these rules. And so one, which I think is sort of interesting, solution to that is actually you can just change the rules. And Democrats will say that's like irresponsible, but one, because look, here's how the CBO scored it, and it's going to blow up the budget deficit. One, I think that will be persuasive to some people, but people also like tax cuts more than they probably worry about the budget deficit. Voters do, at least. And two, if you really believe what you're saying about dynamic scoring and the benefits that tax cuts would have for the economy, then it actually won't blow up the budget. I mean, there's always some debate about that. And so one of the issues, there's sort of an argument that I think is reasonably convincing for. So of course, dynamic scoring makes sense on some level. Even the most liberal economists say, yes, of course, it's true. Certain tax rates, if you cut them, you will have feedback effects. The feedback effects are smaller now than they were. That have to be smaller now than they were when you had the Reagan tax cuts or the Kennedy tax cuts, when you're cutting from 70% to 50% the top rate, or 50% to 28%. When the top rate is at 39%, cutting it to 35 or something, it's let's not pretend there's going to be huge effects there. So what Republicans want, and the CBO will, but the CBO, again, because it is agreed that, of course, incentives affect behavior, the CBO does assess these things. And when it comes to corporate tax reform, the Joint Committee on Taxation, which is sort of like a CBO-like body, also scores these things. And they say Representative Camp, who's the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, wrote tax reform legislation this past year, and the JCT said, okay, well, this will actually make the economy 1.5% bigger in 2024 or whatever. But what Camp doesn't get to say is that because of that, and so they'll even score the revenue effects, but he doesn't get to say, therefore, this is going to be like a budget neutral policy because the economy is bigger. So what Republicans want is like, it's called macro dynamic scoring. So that basically you'll be able to say like, this policy change is just going to make the economy bigger. So this legislation doesn't have to be viewed in isolation. And so that's exciting. The dangerous part of that is like, Democrats will be able to say, okay, well, we're going to triple funding for the Department of Education. Here's evidence that that higher achievement in schools, and that possibly higher education spending leads to better economic growth down the road. So therefore, this policy will pay for itself, or this infrastructure policy will pay for itself. So that strikes me as an issue, and so I think that I wonder if people on both sides might think that would be like kind of an unwelcome development. It would bring us down a rabbit hole, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, it might. I mean, it's just a question of, what assumptions you're able to consider under dynamic scoring. Because you're right. I mean, it would be silly to entirely wipe out the idea that, the legislation you're passing could have no effect on the size of the economy, or, that there'd be no feedback mechanism there whatsoever. I think Orrin Hatch, who I think is he going to be incoming Finance Committee chair in the Senate, I think?
Yes, I believe.
Yeah,
yes.
He was, he gave a speech, and maybe like a month ago or whatever. And he said, like, yes, we should go after dynamic scoring, but it's not going to be the, the magic elixir for all our problems. So I think it'll be interesting to see who they nominate. If they go with sort of a mainstream right of center academic, or if, I don't know, they maybe go with someone a little bit more ideological to head the committee. But thank you. You did a much clearer job explaining it than I did, I think. So it's a little early in the morning to talk about dynamic scoring, I think.
Yeah. Well, I guess one other. It's never too early.
But I think one thing is, I mean, it's Republicans are obviously perfectly allowed to pick their own guy now that they have control. So I mean, it's not.
Yeah, the thing that may have made it completely. It basically made it impossible for Elmendorf to be reappointed. I think part of the reason that there was a debate over it is that there are a lot of conservative economists, like sort of more academic, like conservative economists, who like him, who know him, who think he's a really smart guy, and are worried. We're also a little worried, I think, that about whom. Some House Republicans might want to pick, whether the guy wouldn't be, if it's not someone who's not a PhD or comes from what's considered like a more ideological or too Republican friendly organization. One guy in the mix, I think his name is J.D. Foster's from the Chamber of Commerce, and he's like very smart guy, but it's just like you kind of open yourself up to these. So it's like, oh, the Republicans installed the Chamber of Commerce economist in Congress, and it's just like. But the thing that probably was the final nail in the coffin for poor Doug Elmendorf was the whole Gruber controversy. That drew attention to like these CBO scores do matter immensely, and people get very angry when they feel like they're incorrect. So
yeah, I thought that was because I remember there was Americans for Tax Reform, which is Grover Norquist's organization, wrote a memo to and widely. Well, I mean, they were publicizing it all over the place, but a memo saying, Elmendorf got Grubered, which is, which I thought was very convenient. This Gruber thing is coming up right now when they're talking about picking the next CBO chair, so director. So, yeah, I don't know. That was an interesting little side point. But have we said all there is to say about the CBO? The most exciting story of 2014. Perhaps ever. I don't know.
Yes, I guess the last note would be that we do have to note that Betsy Woodruff, the normal host here, did write
the esteemed Betsy Woodruff.
The esteemed Betsy Woodruff did write a piece about this, which I'm sure was probably her most trafficked piece so far in her career at Slate.
Yeah,
really blew up.
So, what do you think? Any big 2015 predictions? Would you think? Either from Congress or from the presidential trail, any predictions? Who's going to run? Who's not going to run? What's going to get passed? What's not going to get passed? Do you want to put your neck on the line? Because I don't necessarily want to do that.
I'll put my neck on the line in betting against that a very unlikely thing won't happen, which my friends who are sports gamblers and finance say that's a terrible idea. You never want to short the long tail. But apparently, but I would say that the talk of there being corporate tax reform strikes me as exceedingly unlikely. And it's just I don't know why, for some reason it's something that people like to talk about, and I suppose that the business community is so interested in it that they get both experts and reporters and people in Congress to talk about it as if this might be the year. But it strikes me as unlikely.
Yeah, I mean, whenever the last couple of years, or I don't know, I guess, however long you remember, people have been talking about wanting to do tax reform, and you just look at the atmosphere in Washington now, the relationship between the two parties and lack of trust between the two parties, and I just don't, it's very hard to see tax reform, which is one of the most difficult things to do, happening. I mean, even if corporate tax reform might be a little easier than individual tax reform, you have every lobbyist in the country descending on you, and if the idea is to lower rates while closing some so-called loopholes, I mean, those loopholes for a lot of people are extremely something that they really want to protect. So it's just a real difficult thing to do and requires a lot of trust. And it sounds like it might be a difficult achievement. It would take a while too. So
to give you a sense of how hard it is to get anywhere, I mentioned earlier that this Republican Dave Camp, who's the chairman of the Tax Writing Committee in the House, wrote a plan earlier this year, and a day or two later, John Boehner didn't trash it, but he said it's not going anywhere. And this was this pretty middle of the road, and he said we're not really interested in taking that up. So it's tough out there for corporate tax reformers. What about you? Any predictions?
Oh, I don't know. I'm just trying to think of what they could possibly get done. I don't know. Maybe they might give trade promotion authority to the president to finish a couple of his trade deals in the Pacific.
There's small things. There's that.
I don't know. I don't. There are a couple of small things. I don't. Patent reform. But they're not going to obviously get comprehensive immigration reform done. They're not going to get, probably not going to get tax reform done. I don't even know what else they were even talking about. And I think those were the two sort of big things that people have sort of naively been saying they might do next year. But
one of the, I guess we've been thinking about in the wake of the Cuba decision, sort of topic on the right has been what are all of course. We should have known this was going to happen because, of course, this is something that Obama, one, can do because the president has, just a great deal of power of foreign policy. So there's no way to block it, and, you can't pretend that he can't establish an embassy there if he wants.
Right.
But so he's, sort of should have seen that one coming, and I wonder sort of what all the other things are that he would like to get done before he leaves office, and one of which is probably closing Guantanamo Bay. And I guess there's some talk about even sort of how the two goals are related, but I wish I had a crystal ball where I could decide what all those other things are. But
I mean, it's hard. It's really hard to see how you get to close Guantanamo Bay because each defense authorization that they pass, has explicit instructions basically preventing him from exercising some of the authority he needs to get Guantanamo closed, either bringing prisoners to domestic prisons here or he really has very little leeway there, but I think he really does. I think, that was one of his biggest promises in 2008, and it's something that I think he would like to find a way to finish up, but it's hard to see how he's able to do that. I don't know, he seems to be enjoying himself again, which is sort of interesting. I think he, during the midterms, I guess he agreed with Harry Reid, fine, I'll keep my mouth shut while these campaigns are running, and he just sort of seemed to be lagging on the job, and now he, I don't know, that's the impression I got from the last press conference, at least, that he seems to be excited about his final 2 years, which, who knows what surprises that may bring, so.
Yeah, and he's found his stride in terms of, there are actually lots of things, lots of things the president can do. It's not, he can't get, stimulus spending through, and he can't do lots of things that Obama would like to do, but there are lots of areas where he has a great deal of power, or at least that Congress can't really stop him if he, so.
Right.
Yeah. Well, I think that just about wraps us up. It was a pleasure chatting with you, Jim. And
yeah, it was great.
I hope we lived up to everyone's filled the big shoes of Woodruff and Strauss.
I know, yeah, they're off vacationing. Who knows, the south of France, maybe. But we're filling in here, and hopefully we did a noble job here. But we'll see. We'll see what the commenters say.
I'd like to think so. Well, and a Merry Christmas and Happy New Year to the commenters.
Yes. God bless you, commenters.
All right. Thanks. Good talking to you, Jim.
Yep. Bye.